This lesson is use the Fetch API to retrieve a list of data. In this lesson, we're going to create a website using Lite-Server. We're going to build an HTML page that we can use to make our fetch calls from. We're going to retrieve a list of JSON objects, but when we do that, I'm going to show you two different things. We're going to view the Fetch API response object by itself. Then we'll talk about retrieving that body property as JSON. We'll also retrieve a single JSON object and take a look at using the catch method. All right, let's build a little website using Node.js and Lite-Server. So let's open another instance of Visual Studio Code, and let's go ahead and just use the terminal window that I have open down here, and we'll just make a new directory. I'm going to call it Fetch API Samples. And then let's go ahead and open that folder. So we'll drill down in my samples, Fetch API Samples there, and I'll select that folder. Now we'll open a terminal window in here, and we'll do an npm init, and I'm just going to use the -y option. Next, we will go ahead and npm install Lite-Server. We'll save that. So we get our node modules folder up there. We get our package.json, of course. And if we open up this package.json, I'm going to go ahead and add a start. And I'm going to just do the Lite-Server here. What that allows me to do will be that npm-start. Let's go ahead and create a new file now called index.html. Remember, we need a page on which we can make our calls. And for the basic page, let's just go ahead and put in this. I've got the head, I've got the body, and within the body, I've got a little h1 there. Now, if we try this out, let's go ahead and save this file. We should be able to do an npm start, and it should bring up the page, and we see the header. Let's now take a look at getting all the data using our Fetch API and showing the response object. Now you can just leave your browser up, and then we can change within the body here. We can add a div with a button, and the button will have an on-click set to this function, getAllData. Then we'll have a script tag, and within there we'll have our constant server URI, which will point to that web API server we created in Node.js. Remember, I put it at localhost :5000, and remember I added that prefix on API. Then in our function getAllData, we call fetch, and we pass in that server URI /people because we want the full thing to be that HTTP localhost 5000/API/people. And all I'm going to do now, just for this demo, is I'm going to use a .then, just one, because I want to spit out the response object that we get back from the Fetch API. We also have our catch block. Hopefully we won't need that. Let's go ahead and save this. If we then go back to our browser, we should now see the Get All button has appeared. Bring up your browser tools, typically F12. Let's go ahead and click on the Get All, and we now see the response object here. So you can see we get a body. Now you can't read the body because the body is actually not available to us at this point. We haven't actually said to get it. But this is an example of our response object. So where is this body coming from? Well, it comes from our web API that we wrote. So in the router.get, where I had /people, that's the one we just called, I went out and got the data from the file. That is then returned back in that function data passed into that function that we then do a response.status200.json, where we now create our own object that we're going to pass back that will have a status of 200, a status text of OK. I've added my own message here called all data retrieved, and then I've added a data property that I'm setting to the data that is returned from that file, so that array of JSON objects. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and get all the data using the Fetch API again, but we'll add in one more then, and we'll get just the body using the .json method. So let's go back. And right here in between, I'm going to add a then where I'll get the response. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert it to JSON. I'm going to convert the JSON that's in that body to an actual JSON object. And that is what then gets passed on to the then. Let's go ahead and save this. Back in the browser, you can see that it's been refreshed because there's nothing down here in the console. Let's go ahead and click on the Get All. And now what we're seeing is our object that we passed back in the body. So what it does, that .json method says, hey, I'm expecting that you are passing back a JSON object to me. So I'm going to go ahead and extract that out of the body. And that's what I will then pass on to the next then that then spits out on the console here. And now we can see the message that we wrote, the status text, and most importantly, we can see all of the data. Do you know why you should subscribe to YouTube channels? You'll get notifications when new videos appear. You'll get recommendations for related channels. It helps the channel grow, which allows me to create more videos for you. It helps attract others to my channel. Your like helps others find videos that are good. So please take the time to like and subscribe to my channel, Paul D. Sheriff. Let's now take a look at getting a single JSON object using the Fetch API. Go back to your HTML page, and just above the button, let's add another div. And inside of here, we're going to add a person ID label and an input for that person ID. Then just below that button, let's add another button called getARow, which will call a function called getRow. And what we'll do is just below this getAllData, let's add that new function in there. And what we're going to do inside of here is we're going to get the ID from that value in the input field. We're then going to call fetch, passing in our server URI /people/ and we're passing in that ID. So that will be passed to that other route that we entered there that gets a single person object. Then we use the same then to unwrap that body and pass that on to the next then, and we will then spit that out on the console. All right, let's go ahead and save this. Let's go back to the browser. We see now our person ID input field. We see the getARow button. If we click on this and we've done everything okay, that object got passed back, the status 200. The status text is okay, the message single person retrieved, and then the data itself is that single person object that we passed back. If we were to take a look at this by going back over to our index.js where we were writing our router.get functions here, you can see that we've now called this one that you see here on line 41, router.get /people. :ID means this is going to be a parameter that we're expecting to come in. We then use that request.params.id to grab that ID, pass it to our repository calling the get by ID. That is then the method that gives us back that single object. But notice that we've wrapped it now within a same JSON object. So response.status200.json, we have our status text, our message, and then the data is the data, which is that single JSON object being returned. Let's talk a little bit about that status property. So normally HTTP status codes from 100 to 299 are considered successful. However, the Fetch API considers all calls to be successful, whether it's a 404 not found, a 500 internal server error, all of those, it doesn't matter. It will still just simply give you back a response object. So it's going to be up to you to handle those in your code by checking that status property and then determining what you want to do with a 404 or a 500. So that's going to be left up to you. Now, let's take a look right now at viewing status codes. Now you can see when I have a valid person, we see the status is 200, we see the status text is okay, and then we see data. That is the object that we're returning back from the web API. Let's put in an invalid person ID and click on getARow. You'll see now that the browser is reporting this as a 404 not found, and it's saying it's an error. However, the Fetch API, all it's doing is giving us back the same object again, but this time without a data property, but an error property is found there. And the error property has two properties there, the code and the message within its object. But otherwise, the status is still a 404, the status text is still not found. Now let's do something. I want to go back because I want to show you something. Let's go in and we'll add, in this first one, we're going to add a return the response.json. But before we do that, I want to show you the real response object. So in that first then, I'm going to show you the response object, and then I'll return the response.json, which is what then takes it and passes it to the next then. So we've saved this. Let's go back to our browser. And again, let's run this with get a row. And now you see the response. This is the response object that is for the fetch API. And you see that OK is a true. Okay, I didn't include that in my object, but that's fine. We don't really need it. Let's now put an invalid person ID in and do the same thing. Now you can see that the response object has the OK is false. This is how the fetch API communicates to you that it has an invalid status code, an HTTP status code. So 200 to 299, OK is set to true. 300 to 599 or whatever it goes up to is going to be an OK of false. So that means that what you could do is somewhere inside of here, you could actually check to see if response.status is 200 to 299, or you could simply check and say if response.OK. All right, if it was, then you could go on and return that response.json, or you may redirect to some other thing. You may actually display something in a label somewhere. So lots of ways you can handle this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on. For now, I'm going to go ahead and put this back to the way it was, and then we'll move on. So I'm just trying to show you little bits and pieces. We're going to get it all together eventually, but for now, let's take one more look, though, at something else that's in there, and that's that catch method. We really haven't shown you what that is for. So let's go ahead, and I'll show you how to see a real exception that the fetch API considers a real exception. The catch is going to catch things like network problems. So a network problem might be that the internet's down, you can't communicate to the server, or maybe you got the wrong address. So I'm going to go ahead and change this server URI. So instead of localhost :5000, I'll just set it to 500. Let's save that. Let's go back to our browser. And now let's go ahead and click on either one of these. It doesn't really matter. It's going to take a little bit longer because it detects that it can't get somewhere. And now the catch has invoked this console.error, and it's putting out that type error there, failed to fetch at get all data. So again, if we go back and we look at the code back here, you can see that catch is doing a console.error. And that's why we're getting that type fetch, and it's telling us that it can't find that connection. So in this lesson, we created a simple website with an HTML page where we added some buttons, and then we used our fetch function to call some web API endpoints. We saw examples of a 200 and a 404, and we saw an example of how we might display and handle some network errors. Don't worry, we're going to cover a lot more about handling status codes and things like that. But for now, coming up next, check the JSON response object.